Let's get into some practical steps in decision making, ethical decision making. Here's eight steps to sound ethical decision making in business. 1. Get the facts. The philosophical approaches don't tell us to gather the facts. They assume that we will complete this important step. Many people jump to solutions without having the facts. Ask yourself, how did this situation occur? Are there historical facts that I should know? Are there facts concerning the situation that I should know? Fact gathering is easier said than done. Many ethical choices are particularly difficult because of the uncertainty involved in them. Facts may be simply unavailable. In the financial crisis, decision makers not only failed to gather good information, but it appears that they have explicitly avoided gathering the facts. For example, mortgage lenders processed mortgages for unemployed people because they required no documentation to prove employment. All the person had to do was claim to have a job and the mortgage would be processed. The mortgage lender earned fees for creating and processing the loan. It was then sold off to a secondary mortgage market where it was packaged with other mortgages and sold to investors. The fact that the person with the mortgage was unemployed and would likely not be able to sustain payment was simply ignored. Step 2. Define the ethical issues. Many of us have an automatic response to ethical dilemmas. We jump to a solution without really thinking through the ethical issues and the reasons for a response. For example, in the layoff case, one person might say, "Oh, that's easy. Promise keeping is an ethical issue. Pat has to keep her promise to her boss and protect her job." Another person might say that honesty is the key ethical issue, and that just to tell the truth about this to her friend. Don't jump to solutions without first identifying the ethical issues and points of value, conflicts in the dilemma. Also, recognize that the toughest situations usually involve multiple ethical issues that go back to the philosophical approaches as we just discussed. For example, in the layoff case, the ethical issue has to do with the rights of both worker and the company. How would you define the worker's rights to know about the plant closing in advance? How much advance notice is appropriate? What does the law say? Another ethical issue had to do with the company's right to keep the information private. What is the company's obligation to its workers in this regard? At a more personal level, there are ethical issues related to principles such as honesty, loyalty, and promise keeping. Is it more important to be honest with a friend or keep a promise to the boss? Who was owed more loyalty? Think about the situation from a justice or fairness perspective. What would be fair to the company and those who would be laid off? Points of ethical conflict may go back to the conflict between utilitarian and deontological approaches. For example, if I tell the truth consistent with the principle of promise keeping, bad things may happen, negative consequences. A utilitarian would think about the issues in terms of harms and benefits. Who is likely to be harmed? Who is likely to benefit from a particular decision or action? What is the bottom line for society overall? A virtue ethics approach would suggest thinking about ethical issues in terms of community standards. Does your relevant moral community identify a particular action as right or wrong, and why or why not? When we are under pressure or in a rush, our inclination is to stop with the first ethical issue that comes to mind. For example, in our layoff case, you might be inclined to stop with the issue of loyalty to a friend. Challenge yourself to think of as many issues as you possibly can. Here's where talking about the problem with others can help. Present the dilemma to a coworker, to your spouse, or to your friend. Ask them whether they can see other issues that you have missed. Step 3. Identify the affected parties and the stakeholders. Both utilitarian and deontological thinking involves the ability to identify parties affected by the decision. Utilitarian philosophies will want to identify all those stakeholders who are going to experience harm and benefits. The deontologists will want to know whose rights are involved and who has a duty to act in the situation. Being able to see the situation through others' eyes is a key moral reasoning skill. Lawrence Kohlberg developed a theory of moral reasoning called skilled role-taking. It means putting oneself in others' shoes and being sensitive to others' needs and concerns. Frequently, you have to think beyond the facts provided in a case in order to identify all affected parties. It often helps to begin with the individuals in the case who are immediately affected, and then progressively broaden your thinking to incorporate larger groups. Earlier, I introduced the concept of stakeholders. That is, all those individuals or groups who have a stake in a particular decision or action. In the context of ethical decision-making in business, we should identify stakeholders affected by the decision and ask how they are affected. Try to make your thinking as broad as possible. Some stakeholders affected by the decision may not even be born yet. Step 4. Identify the consequences. After identifying the affected parties, think about the potential consequences for each party. This is derived from a utilitarian approach. It isn't necessary to identify every possible outcome. You shouldn't try to identify consequences that have a relatively high probability of occurring and those that would have a particular negative consequence if they did occur. Who would be harmed by a particular decision or action? For example, in our layoff case, telling the truth to a worker might cause Pat to lose her job, which would have negative consequences for Pat and her family. However, it would give her worker, and presumably other workers, the benefit of more time to look for new jobs, perhaps save many families from negative financial consequences. Can you determine which situation would accomplish the greatest net good and the least harm for society? And there's long-term versus short-term consequences. In business decisions, it is particularly important to think about short-term and long-term consequences. Are you confident that your behavior will be considered ethical over a long period of time, even if the circumstances or people change? In our layoff case, is the long-term health of the company and people who will remain employed more important than the short-term consequences to the 200 workers who will be laid off? And don't forget about symbolic consequences. In business, it's extremely important to think about potential symbolic consequences of an action. Every action, every decision sends a message. It stands for something. What message will a particular decision or action send? What will it mean that if it is misunderstood? For example, if Pat does not tell her worker the truth, and he finds out later that she knew, what would the symbolic message be to the workers and the other workers who work for Pat? That she's more interested in saving her own hide than in taking care of them? From a leader's perspective, what are the symbolic consequences of accepting tickets to a football game from a valued client when your organization has a rule against accepting gifts from clients? Although the leader may see going to the game as important for getting a big sell, the symbolic message it will likely convey to employees is that rules do not apply to senior leaders. Such a symbolic message can have dire consequences for the organization, because employees may feel that the rule should not apply to them either. Consequences of secrecy. If a decision is made in private, in order to avoid some negative reaction, think about the potential consequences if the decision were to become public. Think about the disclosure rule here. If you're inclined to keep it a secret, that should be a clue that something isn't right. For example, the public was outraged by the fact that the tobacco industry secretly knew about the negative health effects of cigarettes.